the title of our session, just to be absolutely clear, is how can traceability, certification and enforcement help address the responsible supply challenge? And I think the subtitle really is governance as the Achilles heel of that. So is governance strong enough to do so? Let me start, Camina. I'm going to go right down to the far end to start, to give us a bit of a framework as to how you have OECD guidelines, of course, but how to frame the demands of certification and traceability. What do you point out for, indeed, all our colleagues?
Oh, thanks, David, and salam alaikum, and it's a great privilege to be here. We were for the ministerial these days, and it's great. I think the title is very well, is apt. I mean, governance risks are, a big issue, a central factor, also discouraging, investment, trust, development and growth. So this is, and certification and traceability, I think is a very important, is certainly a part of the solution, but should be framed, and that's our role, I would say, in a broader due diligence, approach. And actually, we are at Future Minerals Forum. This is an area where there are no boundaries because is a global market, global for investors, global for companies, multinational, and no boundaries. But also, we cannot tolerate too many differences also in the engagement in local communities, workers. And so this is quite important also to have more, resilient than supply chain. That's why I think and the role of an international organization as a standard setter. Sometimes people do not like the word standards. They're scared, top-down approach. Okay, one size does not fit all, but it's important to have a global approach then adapted to local realities like can be, everywhere. Now we have, you mentioned, David, thank you for that. Okay, we have broader, guidelines, actually the multinational enterprise guideline for responsible business conduct, but we have the guidance for due diligence, guidance for responsible supply chains of minerals. I sell my carpet, and they were, 15 years enshrined in Lusaka Declaration with many African countries. Very happy, Matthew, that they are very widely, used by LME, by many participants and countries. So this is important, but they are there not to impose anything, not as another layer, because due diligence must have, you really need to believe that the behaviors are important and are good, actually even for profitability, but for medium, long term. So risk-based approach, flexibility and proportionality. And these are maybe framework, not a standard, but not for perfection. I've been working in corporate governance for a lot, Complier explain. These are standards for improvement. And this is the way. So I would say I revert the sentence, not one size, but fit for all.
No, thank you. It's always slightly frustrating when it's not for perfection, but it's for improvement. But I take your point entirely. Matt, can I bring you in here? So London Metals Exchange, you have a reputation to uphold here, and there is an expectation that it will be built on responsible supply. So A, how do you make sure that happens? I suppose that's the most important part of the question. And B, would you accept that the onus is on you to make it happen? Or do you accept that the guidelines that we'd get from ICMM, for example, would be sufficient?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. And I think the answer is the onus is on us to reflect what the industry wants. So the LME should never be in a position where we are preaching to the industry and telling them what to do, but when we reach a global consensus, the LME should absolutely reflect that. So maybe just to illustrate, if people buy metal on the LME, that metal will be delivered in a location that we have licensed. And since we're here, I'm delighted to say that as of this month, that includes Jeddah Islamic Port. So for the first time, we can deliver metal here in the kingdom. But it must be of a brand that we license as well. And for 150 years, we've licensed those brands purely on metallurgical quality. In 2019, with the support of our whole industry, we made a very consequential decision that we would embed responsibility standards into those requirements. And I do have to recognize the huge work that the OECD did on this. Without those standards, and I also carry around my copy of the book. Fortunately, it's also available in an A5 version, so it's a bit smaller, but it's one of my key documents, because without that, we would not have had a framework to embed. Because the OECD did the work, because industry rallied around it, and because it became a global consensus, we could embed that into our brand listing requirements, and that means that now anybody buying metal on the LME knows that the metal will conform to not just the metallurgical specifications, but those responsibility specifications.
Right. Could I just to add on to that for a moment, one of your colleagues said to me, look, we've uncovered a lot of mess. We've discovered most of the problems. So can you give me some sort of proof, if you like, evidence that you're making this work? Have you delisted? What have you done?
Yeah, so the rules, our final rules came into effect on the 1st of January last year, so just over a year ago. And we did end up suspending about 10% of the brands on our list because they didn't quite get there. Now, I don't say that with any pleasure because we don't want to do that, but I think to your point, it is important that the brands who have done the work see that they are treated fairly, and those who maybe didn't do the work don't have the same treatment. Now, that having been said, I think what we should all be striving for is constant improvement. And actually, my favorite statistic is of those brands that we sadly had to suspend, about 11 so far have been reinstated because they did the work to meet the requirements. And that, I think, is the right model, that you set out your requirements, you are strong about enforcing them, but you work with people to get everybody over the line.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Elaine, let me bring you in. And a lot of focus for you is on gold, and there are some pretty key issues around that. Where do you fit in terms of what you expect, what is the responsibility of the miners in terms of transparency, yes, but good governance?
Well, thank you, David, and thank you to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for having this event and having this conversation, because it's so very important. If we're going to be able to secure the supply chain and understand the provenance of all our materials, not just gold, not just cobalt, but the materials that are mined in all of our countries, you have to have both the regulation, which is the role of government or organizations like the OECD. You have to have standards that the mining companies set. Those have to be enforced. So there are roles for government, for the far upstream sector, which is the mining sector, but also for the downstream processors and the ultimate customers to make sure that we not only have the regulations and the systems and the standards, but that those are enforced, that they're understood, and that they're verified. It's one thing to talk about those things, but it's another thing to ensure that we really understand chain of custody.
So do you feel the end user customer really wants to push it all back down the line?
Yeah, if the gold winds up at a refinery and a smelter and they cannot verify where it came from, they should send it away. Now that takes not just compliance, it takes will. It means you have the political will or the economic wherewithal to do what we all want to do. We're talking at this conference about mining being a force for good, creating a better world. And that takes not only system and regulation, it takes all of us playing our part and having the courage to do that.
Brian, I want to bring you in here. TechMet is about sourcing these critical minerals to provide the wherewithal for us to move to a green transition. So the purpose is perfect. We've got examples that we've had from Carmina there. We have a number of standards out there that companies are expected to comply to. I'm not sure you're entirely in tune with what those demands are. Are they too much?
No, I'm certainly fully in tune with the objectives. The issue is the mechanisms to achieve those objectives. And we have to see traceability and governance standards in the context of the energy transition and in the context of the geopolitical landscape surrounding critical minerals supply chain security. So there's an imperative for us to transform the metals and mining industry in three ways. One, in terms of volumes, because we need many, many multiples of global supply of lithium and nickel and cobalt and rare earth metals over the next 2, 5, and 10 years. The second is in terms of traceability and standards and responsible engagement with environments and communities and low carbon footprint. And the third is to transform our industry in such a way as to balance China's overwhelmingly dominant position across all of these global supply chains with all of the national security, industrial competitiveness and jobs and growth and national and international geopolitical implications for Europe and the US and elsewhere. And there are trade-offs, and there's some real challenges in balancing these three imperatives. So particularly the third one, if we're going to build competitiveness of industry in the Gulf, in the US, in Europe, we need to produce competitively in order to not undermine the ability to generate returns when you're building electric vehicles or batteries. And to do things responsibly, which we're committed to do, takes more time and costs more. And therefore, we do need systems of traceability, we do need governance standards, we do need uniformity, but we need to do it with innovation and not with formulaic bureaucracy and box ticking, which adds to cost, delays projects, and further impedes our ability to invest, justify investment, generate returns in order to build volumes to competitively feed non-Chinese industry so that we can build projects and generate growth and jobs in our countries while we uphold the standards that we're committed to uphold.
Carmine, you were nodding to that, but at the same time, box ticking is, certification, traceability, there's box ticking involved in all of that. It slows the process down, and at a time when you want to accelerate the provision of these critical minerals.
Now, I take the point, and I really agree with you. I'm a bit, I would say, biased. I had a previous experience. I was a commissioner in the Italian Securities Commission, but then I worked 15 years in the industry. And I think that's why I think it's a bottom-up approach, not top-down. If you really believe, that something is correct, then you feel it. That's why we need this adaptation, this improvement, not these, binary rules. Especially because one issue came to my mind while you were speaking, that, this is, critical minerals, this is a long-term cycle, okay, from the very beginning, exploration, structure. So we cannot, let's say, wait to have everyone behaving correctly, or, for example, not investing in risky countries. This is not, and exactly, for example, is our approach. This is a risky business, and you have to engage with everyone, because, again, hoping that then, let's say, with the due diligence, you can improve, these behaviors, and also giving growth. So the wealth of resources in some countries, let's be, sincere. This has not been in all over these years also at the benefits of those countries. So I think we should, that's why exactly we should behave.
Elaine.
Well, I think traditionally when we talk about standards and conformance and compliance, even with the best of intentions, it can be a box-checking exercise and a burden on mining companies. But we have technology today that's going to enable us to do the traceability piece of this much more efficiently and much more effectively using tools like blockchain and ledger technology. The World Gold Council has put in a program to ensure that the gold can be traced all the way up through the refinery using ledger technology. And there are other things that I'm sure I'm not smart enough or young enough to understand. But I think we have an opportunity to do things differently now that we didn't have a decade ago when it comes to compliance and conformance.
Matt, I'm going to bring you in on that, because gold is one thing, and perhaps traceability is possible. I think the figure is about 20% of gold mined is illegal or illegally mined.
Or artisanal.
Artisanal, which is obviously slightly different, but a portion of that would be. So there's still a huge chunk that is a problem there, but perhaps gold is a very simple commodity compared to some others. I mean, if you're dealing with all of them, is traceability a realistic approach for everything?
Yeah, so I think one of the real privileges of having been involved in this topic over the last 5 years is you get to speak to a lot of different people. And actually, just building on the box ticking point, this is an area where I think there's actually a very strong alignment of views between those in industry who clearly don't want box ticking, but also civil society who also don't want box ticking, right? Civil society are very, very clear that they don't want anything that can be used for greenwashing. So I think the answer here is one of transparency, and transparency is an extremely important concept. And so maybe just looking at the way that we implement the OECD guidance. So one way that a producer can choose to meet the LME's responsible sourcing requirements is through a transparency approach where they fill in a form which corresponds to the red flag approach under the OECD guidance. They map out their supply chains, they map out where they're mining, where the transit countries are. They then compare that against their view of red flag countries, because there's not a single list of that, and publish it. Now, obviously, not all producers want to do that because there are questions of commercial confidentiality, etc. And so we have other routes by which that can be audited, and then the audit report can be given out, or you can go for a full industry standard. But I think it is important, because it really goes to Elaine's point, that traceability and the transparency that relates to that is, I think, in the interests of industry. It's certainly where civil society wants us to go on this topic, and I think it perhaps heralds a way forward.
This is the problem. Some of civil society, others want it cheap. That's the bottom line. They want things cheap. And there's no incentive in this process, to be crude about it, to put extra costs on yourself. Brian, I think that's perhaps the point that you would make.
Yeah, I mean, that's our challenge, and I don't think it's realistic for us to expect any sort of efficient two-tier pricing that will result in our customers paying more for product that is produced and processed responsibly. But I do believe, in addition to innovation to make traceability and ensure responsible and high standards efficiently without encumbrances from a cost and bureaucracy point of view, we do need regulatory support. You know, we do need to ensure that there are carbon border adjustments. We do need to ensure that governments create a level playing field by penalizing sources of supply to their domestic industry that are not well governed and are not traceable and not transparent. So we do need the US and others to put in place mechanisms where Chinese-controlled nickel production out of Indonesia with low environmental standards, low labor standards, is not competing on an equal playing field for supply into US battery manufacturing or other industry with clean, low carbon footprint, well-governed nickel production, such as that which we're developing in Brazil. And we also need end users, like the automakers, to ensure that they give us, as clean, responsible producers, not necessarily a higher price, because they can't afford to pay a higher price with undermining their ability to compete with the Chinese or other players who enforce lower standards on their supply chains, but at least give us preferential access and are prepared to share equity risk in their supply chains in order to drop our cost of capital and allow us to invest more and do what we need to do to provide traceable and transparent and responsible supply chains.
Kamina.
No, just, I think we are luckily going to a point where this is not because we are nice, it's nice to behave in such a way, and maybe this is not priced, correctly, we shouldn't. I think we should really understand that last year at the IEA meeting, we presented a paper saying that really responsible is reliable. So responsible sourcing is for profit. I mean, is in the interest of everyone, middle long term, because to have really then more, reliable, resilient than supply chain, which is Again, I think it's a Pareto improving, we say as economists, so it's a win-win, situation. And part of this, obviously, is disclosure, and I utterly agree with that. And so the answer to our title is surely yes, so transparency. Sunlight is the best of disinfectants, someone was saying. And actually, on this, David, just to flag you, in March, we will present a joint paper of the OECD and IEA exactly on traceability in supply chain, which I think is really part of the game.
Yeah. Matt, you wanted to come in on that? Yeah.
Yeah, so just on the pricing points, obviously, as an exchange, pricing is a core topic of what we do, and I think it is this fascinating question, and it's absolutely the right challenge, is are responsible producers being rewarded for what they do? Now, I would argue, and unfortunately, because there are many other factors driving price, I cannot prove this, but I would argue that us having embedded the OECD requirements into the brand lists means that the LME prices, all else being equal, are higher than where they would be if we had not done that. Because the LME price, by definition, is the price of the least valuable unit in the system. That's how physical contracts work. And by removing those brands who have not done the work, the LME price isn't the price of a non-compliant brand, it's the price of a compliant brand. So I do believe that if we hadn't done it, producers would be realizing less if they're pricing off LME prices, so that would be the first step. But I think we can go further, and I would be fascinated to see whether, as an industry, we could rally around even higher standards, which then command premium pricing. Now, that's going to require, exactly as you say, buy-in from all elements of the supply chain. You know, we're very good at talking about this concept. Are people actually going to deliver on it? But I think it's exactly the right challenge.
It's a very interesting concept that you lay out there, Matt. I wonder, at a time like this where I think you're seeing big financial institutions backing away from net zero, ESG falling down the priority list, that maybe that's a path to be trodden rather than a path that's already started. But Elaine, sorry, I know you also wanted to get in on this.
Well, I think maybe come in on 2 points. One is to come back to a point that my colleague made. Good standards of responsible mining from an industry point of view actually help you have a better ability to deliver on your business strategy, to cost effectively manage your business, to have regulatory flexibility. So while the cost may look like they're more upfront, over the long run, you're going to benefit if you're operating to a high standard. And that's what we found across the industry with the companies that have embraced, say, the ICMM
It's not a cost,
standards.
it's an investment.
Well, you have to make an initial investment, but if you're in it for the long term, you're going to be able to attract better employees.
Yeah.
We want people to want to work in the mining sector and to see it as an exciting and dynamic place to work and a responsible place to work. And having high standards helps us do that. And I think we also should challenge the value chain and have the end users provide the proper incentives. There are alternatives to price, like Brian just said. Why shouldn't they pay a fair price for a responsibly produced material?
Can I just say, sorry to interrupt, we're quite short on time. We've talked a lot about mechanisms here, certification, traceability, etc. You're all only too aware there's also, this is about humankind. There is a human tragedy taking place in South Africa right now in gold mines. 60 miners, illegal miners, brought up. They've lost their lives, 60. There's still 100 plus down there as part of an enforcement measure by the authorities, which is not entirely unwelcome, I should add as well. But Elaine, this is the reality of the story we're talking about with responsible sourcing.
Indeed. I mean, there are a lot of people in many countries that are working in appalling conditions, illegally and also legally, but under standards that aren't being enforced. And it's an issue for the larger industry to have a role in dealing with that, but also governments to do better at creating opportunities and to enforcing things before they get to that kind of stage. But it's difficult. It's very, very difficult. There's not an easy answer to this. It's easy to be critical of what's taken place, but that's been a situation that's been building for a long time and really hard to solve. But this opportunity for traceability And the standards and certification provides a venue for governments to better formalize some of the artisanal and small-scale mining, for large mining companies to be incentivized to bring that into a supply chain where you have a chain of custody that's verifiable and you have the appropriate due diligence. So
Thank you for addressing it. It's desperately difficult.
It's very, very
Fully
sad.
agree. Yeah.
But we have to not give up and keep working at this.
Committee, a last word to you, partly on that. That's about enforcement, and maybe governments have a role to play in, legalizing certain elements of this. Most of the rest is voluntarism. And is that going to be enough? And you've got 20 seconds.
No, but just the answer is not surely even in critical cases to withdraw. The answer is exactly the opposite, to engage more with governments, with communities, and with others. And so I think we can also build a successful, more engagement for medium and long-term, cycle. Thank you.
Thank you. That was 20 seconds. Very well wrapped up. There's so much more to cover. Time is upon us, though. We're going to have to stop it there. Thank you all very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, please express your appreciation for our panel. Thank you.